You're listening to Talkline with Zev Brenner, America's premier Jewish broadcast on the air since 1981.
And now, here's your host.
Welcome back to the program, I'm Zev Brenner. I've known David Eisner for so many years. I believe it's the first time we have him on the air. He's the operating partner of a private equity firm, and he was the Assistant Secretary for Management at the Department of U.S.Treasury from 2018 to 2021, and they had oversight over the IRS, and he's been an advocate for more funding for the IRS. So, David, good to have you back. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Zev. Nice to be with you. Thanks for having me.
You know, I was talking off the air, but from what I understand, it seemed like the Trump administration had more Orthodox Jews operating in the administration than any other administration in history, as far as I can tell. You were there. Is that accurate?
Well, since it was my first time in government, it was the most Orthodox Jews of any administration that I'd ever served in. But I wouldn't be surprised if that were the case. Certainly more high-profile Orthodox Jews.
Well, from what I understand from Tom Rose, from what you and I discussed, you built the first sukkah, I believe, in the White House, right?
We did. I think it's the first sukkah in history on the White House complex. And 2018 we had it, and or could have been and then 2019 and then 2020. Unfortunately, we had the COVID and there weren't very many people around, so there wasn't as much of a need for it, but that was really an honor to be able to create that symbol, which was a symbol for sure for most of the world, but for the Orthodox Jews that worked in the White House and the Treasury Department, it was a necessity, and so it was great that we were able to do it.
Because I heard there was black kosher food pretty regularly. There were minyanim, prayer services. So there seemed like there was a lot going on. If you were Orthodox, this probably was the administration to work at, from what it sounds like.
It was certainly comfortable to be an Orthodox Jew in that administration.
Now, you wrote a fascinating article called "Stop the Dangerous Rhetoric: The Truth About IRS Funding." You oversaw the IRS, and you were an advocate for it, but now the reports have come out that they're part of the new bill signed by Congress is that they're going to be $87 million allocated for the IRS, and people are saying, well, this is bad. It's going to penalize people who are small earners. You're going to have 87,000 agents with guns running around. You wrote a piece which challenged both the Democrats and the Republicans regarding the IRS funding. So let's look at that. You see this as a good thing, while many of those say, hey, what do we need $87 million for more IRS agents?
Well, let's first, sorry to correct.
$1 billion, not
$80 billion.
Billion.
$80 billion. What you missed, what you just transposed was that at least it's been reported that they would be hiring 87,000 new agents. So it's a fair and honest miss.
So it's 87,000 agents, and what's the budget for it? $80 billion.
$80 billion, which is not just for new agents. So let me outline what it's about, and then try to kind of address what both your question as well as what my article was about, which was that it's $80 billion, over half of which is for enforcement, which are audits and criminal investigations, and the rest of it is for operation support, which is really mostly technology, as well as rent. They have 600 offices around the country and things like that, and then a few $1 billion for taxpayer service and several $1 billion more for modernizing the technology of the IRS. So most of the attention has really come on the enforcement side, the fact that there will be $45 billion over 10 years going to enforcement. That will essentially double the enforcement budget. The gist of my article, though, was not whether that we can have an honest debate about that. And both Secretary Steven Mnuchin and I were big advocates of more funding for the IRS when we were there. I've written previously to to this last article a number of times about the fact that I thought $80 billion, which had been proposed already a year ago, was too much by at least a factor of two. That is, somewhere between 25 and 40, I think would have very much done the trick. That said, if I had had my choice between no funding and this, what I consider overfunding, I would have probably opted for the latter, because the IRS has been desperately underfunded for the last decade or so. It's less than half the size that it was 20 years ago, with a much larger workload. The gist of my article, however, was that there was dangerous and irresponsible talk on both sides of the aisle, both advocating for this as well as opposing it, by senators such as Senator Chuck Schumer, who made some very irresponsible statements, Senator Ron Johnson, Senator Ted Cruz. And so the gist of my article was really calling them out for what were gross misstatements about what was really going on, and really a plea for the fact that nothing we do in government, the Defense Department, social programs, Homeland Security, could be paid for if the IRS was to fail. The IRS collects 95% of all the revenue that we use to support the government, and so we should be very careful in our rhetoric, and we should be very careful in our facts when we're talking about the IRS.
But here's the thing that I think a lot of people are saying: $87 billion, $80 billion, 87,000 agents that are going to be out there, which means that who are they going to have to justify the cost? So you have to go after the little people. You have to go across the average taxpayer, and the IRS is already the most feared collection agency on earth, probably. So this, I think, adds to fears, and that's why there's so much reaction. What people are saying, why they need so much money to go after. It's going to come on the backs of the middle class and the poorer people.
Right. So let me just give that some context and perspective. And honestly, people of goodwill can debate this issue, but I just want to make sure that the facts are understood. 45 billion is going for enforcement. The 87,000 is not a number that the IRS has used. It's really one that the Treasury Department used in a report a year or so ago about, and it's a gross number, not a net number. So the IRS will lose 50,000 employees to retirement over the next 5 years. So 87,000 quickly goes from 87,000 to 37,000. Not all of those people are for enforcement. So let's say even 2/3 of them are for enforcement. That will be about 22,000. The IRS has 35,000 people approximately working in enforcement today. So even if the IRS doubled its enforcement personnel and its enforcement budget, it would then be able to audit 0.8%, which would be a doubling of the number of audits that there are today. Today, in the last couple of years, there was 0.4% of all returns filed were audited. In 2010, it was 0.9%. So the world didn't come to an end in 2010 when the number of people being audited was twice what it was, and there really are. So I think that it's too much. I think it's too many, but I think that some of the scare tactics that some have used, things like 87,000 new agents running around, well, that's about 4 times more than will actually be the case. And the fact that they'll be running around with guns, which was another misnomer. 2,000 IRS agents, criminal investigation agents, carry guns. These guys are going after terrorists, drug dealers, traffickers, organized crime. People who participate in those activities don't just break the law in those areas. They generally are money launderers and tax evaders as well. The IRS has participated in some of the most important and largest national and international drug and organized crime and terrorist operations. And these guys are like the FBI. These are not guys walking around with pencils in their breast pocket and guns on their hips. These guys are in the most dangerous at work activity that any of us could imagine. Thank God they've got guns.
We're speaking with David F. Eisner, an operating partner of a private equity firm. He was formerly the Assistant Secretary for Management at the Department of U.S. Treasury from 2018 to 2021, and he had an oversight over the IRS. His fascinating article is in The Hill called Stop the Dangerous Rhetoric, the Truth About IRS Funding. You mentioned a few moments ago Senator Chuck Schumer, but he asserted, quote, that the Trump administration did a despicable thing. They didn't audit about anybody who made over $1 million. And they said, if you made $40,000, we're going to audit you because there is a fraud in the earned income tax credit. End the quote. Yeah,
Senator Schumer should know better. The fact is, in the last year of the Trump administration, 8% of taxpayers who earned $10 million or more were audited. 2.5% of taxpayers that earned $1 to $5 million were audited. So that's just not true that we didn't audit taxpayers making more than $1 million. Just to give you a comparison, that compares to between 0.2 and 0.4% of taxpayers making $40,000 to $200,000. So the audit rate is 5 to 20 times greater for higher earning taxpayers than for lower earning taxpayers. And the taxpayers at the low end who are actually audited, which he referred to, are taxpayers who receive something called the Earned Income Tax Credit. And that is basically a social, it's like a welfare program that the IRS runs that sends money to low earning people, whether they pay taxes or not. And it's a very highly, it's a program with a lot of fraud and miscalculation, if you will, in it. And when the IRS says that they audit these taxpayers, they basically send them a letter. It's called a correspondence audit. None of those taxpayers ever have a IRS agent showing up at their house. They get a letter that says, we understand that both you and your husband, who you may not live together, both filed for the same child, or your income that we see reported is 5 times what you said it was, and please clarify. That's the extent of what those audits are. They're called correspondence audits, and there's a lot of fraud in the program. So the IRS naturally has to follow up on areas where they see obvious problems.
Well, you're saying that those that apply for the PPP loans during the COVID time period, that they're also more subject to having these kinds of audits?
No. PPP loans were made by the Small Business Administration and really have nothing to do with audit rates. So it's really a complete. The Small Business Administration is also, I've understood, at the direction of Congress, because there was a fair amount of fraud in the PPP program. I don't think we know quite how much, but the fact of the matter was, I'll talk about that because the Trump administration has taken some criticism for that. But the fact of the matter was, the overwhelming need in 2020 was to get money into the economy. We could have set up all kinds of bureaucracy to make it hard for people to apply, hard for people to get the money. We needed to get the money, and we needed to get it out to people fast. When that happens, there's going to be fraud. Whether that program, looked in its entirety, will be looked at as one of the great successes of not just the Trump administration, but in economic history or not. That is, we we saved the economy from complete collapse, and the PPP program was an element of that. And so I will very, very proudly wear the PPP program as part of the credentials of the administration that I served in.
No, certainly it helped a lot of people, but there was fraud, and I keep reading they're auditing people. I don't know if you say it's not the IRS, but there's somebody auditing people with the PPP loans. So I was curious to know if that fell in the IRS domain. You said it doesn't. So
as a taxpayer, we should all be happy that the people who committed fraud are being investigated.
yeah, no, there should be. If they stole money or took money inappropriately, then it should be investigated. But you know, we spoke about Senator Chuck Schumer. We want to be equal opportunity. You write about Senator Ted Cruz tweeted that the Biden administration has fully weaponized the Department of Justice and the FBI to target their political enemies. And with 87,000 new IRS agents, they're coming in for you too. Is there talk about even the Obama administration about the IRS being politicized against right-wing groups? Is there a concern about the politicization of the IRS, especially with new enforcement powers, more agents, that this can become more prevalent?
Well, let's make sure the answer to that is I think that's always something that we should be on guard for, and I'll come back to that. But what Ted Cruz was talking about, as well as I quoted Senator Ron Johnson as well, was with the suggestion that 87,000 IRS agents were coming after you with guns, and so first of all, it's not 87,000 as I pointed out previously. It's going to be more like 25,000 new agents with an audit rate that will still be lower than it was 10 years ago, even if all of those people get deployed in a year, which will never be the case. And second,
how long would it take to deploy that, to have 87,000 people brought into the system?
Well, remember, 87,000 is net. It's going to be netted against 50,000 who are leaving. So the IRS hires about 7,500 a year anyway, just to replace those who leave. So I think it will take the IRS between 5 and 7 years to deploy the number of. If the number is 87,000, I think it will take them 5 to 10 years to be able to hire that many people.
But I interrupt you. We're talking about Senator Cruz and Senator Ron Johnson's statements, but the question about the politicization of the IRS is a fear that during the Obama years, right-wing groups were audited or couldn't get nonprofit status. There's a fear that with all the politically charged atmosphere we're in today, that we see that politicization with more agents around, more enforcement power. There's more room for this kind of activity to take place.
And the IRS has an oversight agency. It's Inspector General, which is the largest in the federal government, and the commissioner is brought to Capitol Hill almost every month to account. I think, look, we always need to be on guard for politicization, but there are tremendous safeguards in place. Doesn't stop a rogue actor within the IRS from doing something, but it's not a systemic problem, and there are tremendous institutional barriers to that. But you know, this money should come along with additional oversight, and there is a tremendous amount of money, several $1 billion in the bill for oversight, but that should rightfully be utilized.
Do you miss not being part of the Department of the U.S. Treasury?
I had as you know, Zev, I spent most of my career in business, and I had a really fantastic 35 career in business on Wall Street and as a software entrepreneur. But I have to say that working in the Treasury Department was the best job I ever had, and tremendous honor to be able to do it, and to particularly be able to do it during the period of time of COVID and the enactment of the CARES Act, where the Treasury Department was really the tip of the spear in all of the economic relief that was brought. And so I miss the people, and I miss the opportunity to have been of service.
How is Steve Mnuchin to work with or work for?
Well, I had known Secretary Mnuchin for over 20 years. He'd been a founder at one of my companies when he was at Goldman Sachs, and I always used to say then he was the smartest guy in the room at board meetings, and I think he was a fantastic and historical Secretary of the Treasury, and it was a real honor and pleasure to work with him.
It's a shame when each administration comes and goes, they clean house with some of the top people. So I guess you had to leave when the new administration came in.
Yep, I left shortly before noon on January 20th, 2021, but I was one of the last ones out the door.
Oh, you were? Okay. You had to close the light, but okay. Now, what's been the reaction to your article, Stop the Dangerous Rhetoric, the Truth About IRS Funding, which was in The Hill?
So since I left government, I published about a dozen op-eds, and this was by far the one that has received the most interest and attention. And I have to say, almost exclusively positive. And so it was gratifying.
No, good to hear, because it's people listen. The impression that the media gives out, at least when you read some of the papers, is that 87,000 IRS agents with guns are going to be going around, and you're going to have, the audit of the people. The rich people can afford lawyers to challenge audits. The middle class and the poor can. So this will be a onerous burden on the middle class and the lower class. So these are all things that have been out there in the media. And I think you're giving us some perspective of where we should and how we should be looking at the whole overall situation as far as the hiring of 87,000 new agents and $80 billion budget.
I'd say if you cheat on your taxes, the chances are probably going to be double. Your chances of being audited will be doubled. If you don't cheat on your taxes, I don't think you've got too much more to worry about.
David Eisner, operating partner of a private equity firm. He was the Assistant Secretary for Management at the Department of U.S.Treasury from 2018 to 2021. He had oversight over the IRS. As you heard, he's a passionate for public service. And while he's been in the private sector and been in business, but he loved what he did. He's still writing about it. So we appreciate you being here with us.
It was a pleasure, Zev. Nice to see you.
Likewise, and send regards also to Karen and to Jason. Wonderful family. We go back such a long time, and I know you're not as much in New York as you were, but you miss New York.
I do, and get back frequently.
And thank you for joining us.
Okay, Zev. Thank you.
Thanks for listening.
For continuous Jewish programs, TalklineNetwork.com, or our 24-hour-a-day listen line at 641-741-0389. For past shows, you can find us on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, YouTube, Instagram, and all major podcast platforms, or jewishpodcast.org. Thanks for listening to the TalklineNetwork.com.